And what is your song? You know that song that you just can't not sing along to? The one that always gets you moving? The one that just sounds perfect and sweet in your ears? You know what I'm talking about, right? We all have a song. You hear the first few notes and your body begins to prepare for a performance. You know, your feet start tapping. Possibly your hips start swaying. And you just get into it. After the first line of lyrics, you're right there. You're fully invested. And if you're holding back because of who you're with, you get a little nervous because the chorus is coming and you don't know if you can contain yourself. And then there's that long, loud last note at the end that will tempt anyone, even the most deftone, to try and belt it out, right? So you know what I'm talking about. So what is your song? As we look at Psalm 21 today, I want you to notice that this is a song of salvation. The song that God's people whom He has saved sing, and it gets them going. And I hope that by the end of this, you will have the same excitement and the same enjoyment of this song and join in with the people of God today. I want to read Psalm 21, and I just want to start at verse 1. Let's read through the whole thing together. Just follow along as I do that. O Lord, in your strength the king rejoices, and in your salvation how greatly he exalts. You have given him his heart's desire, and have not withheld the request of his lips. Selah. For you meet him with rich blessings. You set a crown of fine gold upon his head. He asked life of you, you gave it to him. Length of days forever and ever. His glory is great through your salvation. Splendor and majesty you bestow on him. For you make him most blessed forever. You make him glad with the joy of your presence. For the king trusts in the Lord, and through the steadfast love of the Most High, he shall not be moved. Your hand will find out all your enemies. Your right hand will find out those who hate you. You will make them as a blazing oven when you appear. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and fire will consume them. You will destroy their descendants from the earth, and their offspring from among the children of man. And though they plan evil against you, though they devise mischief, they will not succeed. For you will put them to flight. You will aim at their faces with your bows. Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength. We will sing and praise your power. Now, most of us know that the Psalms are actually songs or prayers that have been collected and organized in their composition into this one large book of the Bible that we call the Psalms. It was sort of like the hymnal of the congregation of Israel. And what they would do is they would explore the things that God has done. And what we find here is that it goes into the depths of the truths that God has revealed, and it also allows for the emotions right across the spectrum. So you get all these ups and downs and back and forths of what God has done in history for his people. And the reason why we remember them, the reason why we sing about them is to reflect and to not just think about what God has done in the past, but how that strengthens our faith for the present and also for the future. And so what I want us to do is join in with the covenant community of God's people as they worship and then recount the victory that God had given them, that they're singing about here over their enemies, because they have experienced God's faithfulness in specifically his power. For Psalm 21, we need to step into the framework of the ancient Israelites. We need to understand what they were thinking, because a lot of this can seem a little bit foreign to us. The world back then was full of warfare. As a nation, you would be one entity. There would be others around in this world. And anytime you couldn't come to an agreement with another nation, there was always war that would settle it. And that was always an option. And since God had given the Israelites a prized piece of property, we know as the Promised Land, this one section, all the other nations coveted it. And so throughout her history, Israel was filled with many, many battles. They fought a lot as you read through the Old Testament. And that's the reason why so much of the Old Testament is filled with imagery about battle and war and about their enemies that are plotting to destroy them. Now, the writer of this psalm has experienced, as we've read it through, the power of the Most High God in a victory over their enemies. And so he's reflecting on this, and the people are rejoicing in God because God was the one who brought them their victory. And the most prominent characteristic of God that they experienced in that battle is his amazing power. This whole psalm builds up, as you read it through, it builds up to verse 13, which is the crescendo of the whole thing, which describes the hope of God's people and the response of God's people to what he has done. It says, "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." And that's what these people who sing this song, the song of salvation, want to do. The number one thing on their list is that God would be exalted, that his name would be lifted high among all the other gods, that he would be worshiped because he is powerful and he is the one true God above all. So they have experienced his matchless strength in protecting and delivering his beloved people against their evil enemies. And so verse 13 celebrates. It ends like this: "We will sing and we will praise your power." So it's God's power that exalts him above all, and it's God's power that his people are praising him for. And I just want to start there by thinking about what do you think about when you hear about the power of God? When you consider the strong arm of the Lord and think about the ways that his power has acted in your life on your behalf as his people, what do you think of? Are you filled with joy? What kind of emotions do you have? The Psalms want to invite all of this into our experience of singing along with God's people. And so we need to think about the way that this song or this psalm is a song of rejoicing in the power of God that protects and delivers his people from their enemies. So verse 13 then is the chorus. If we were to make this a song, verse 13 is the chorus, right? That's where we want to end there. We want to fill every part of this psalm, that the Lord will be exalted in his strength. Then what I see here is there are two verses or two sections that get us to that crescendo, that get us to the chorus. And you'll see them in the sections verses 1 to 7 and then verses 8 to 12. And how we get there is that God is exalted for the way that he has fought for his people and the way that he has blessed his people. And there's two angles here. One is he is for them, and one is he is against those who oppose them. And in both angles, his people are benefited by his power. But did you notice as we read through this that the king is the one who is talked about most? He gets the focus. The king is the one who is spoken about, who receives what God offers, and he gets the victory. He is the one that is celebrated in this psalm. And the reason for that is because he represents the people, the nation that he is the ruler of. Sort of like a president is seen as the face of a nation. And so the king, the monarch, is the leader of this nation, and the people trust in their king and obey him for the good of everybody. They have one leader, and everyone else benefits by following and doing what the king has said. When they went into battle, they took their directions from the king. When they made deals and decisions about things, the king was the one who made the final decision. And so in this royal individual in the nation, he had the ultimate authority over all the people. And so the king represents the nation, so what happens to the king happens to the nation. And so we bring that into this psalm with us, but there's something unique about the king of Israel among all the other nations. You remember that Saul was the first king, and before he became the king, they didn't have a king. Well, they did, but he wasn't a physical human king. God was their king. Yahweh was the king of Israel, and he led his people through his voice, through his word, whether it came through a prophet or a priest or his written law. That's how he would lead. And so when the people began to demand and say, we want a human king, one we can see, one on the throne, that God gave them their king, but he made sure that they knew that he was still in charge. He said that the king of Israel will have authority, but it is given to him by God. And the king of Israel will have a purpose, but it is directed by God. So that God, in the end, even though they have a human king, he would be glorified. He would be worshiped, because the king would point the people to the Lord ultimately. And so there was two commands primarily that the king was supposed to obey so that this would happen. We know not all the kings did it, but these are the two things. One is the king was commanded not to do something. He was commanded not to build a big army, not to have a big treasury, not to have a big harem, which is what all the other kings of all the other nations usually did to create security and descendants and peace and all of that. So he was supposed to not create that big army for protection. And the second thing he was supposed to do was he was supposed to every year write out a copy of God's law and then read it again and obey it. So ultimately, by design, the king would be given this authority to lead, but he was going to be infused with the scriptures to lead on behalf of God, so that when he did it in this way, he wouldn't have a large army, he would be dependent upon the power of God. And what that would cause is that he would depend on God, and so would the people that he leads. This is the kind of king that the Lord wanted on the throne. And when Israel's king trusted wholeheartedly in the Lord, then the king of heaven would fight for them, would be on their side. And so Psalm 21 is a celebration of God's power given on behalf of his people that comes through the king. And you'll see that God did this because the king was wholly trusting in him. Let's look at verse 1. This is the kind of king that he is. He says, "O Lord, in your strength the king rejoices. And in your salvation, how greatly he exalts." So here we have a king who is undoubtedly loving God and following him. It's obvious to the people who would even sing about this that the king's loyalty resides in the Lord. They would have known this because it would have infused everything he did, whether it was praying in front of the people or leading in his decisions. They would see it and they would hear it in the way that he led the nation. And so this is the kind of king that God wanted to lead his people, one that would lead others to do the very same things. And they would depend upon the Lord for God's power and not their own. In fact, look at verse 2. It seems that the king had likely expressed his prayer to God publicly in front of all the people. Or else how would they have known? It says there, "You, O Lord, have given the king his heart's desire, and have not withheld the request of his lips." They knew what he had prayed. And perhaps before battle, the king gathered all of the people and before them led them in crying out to the Lord for help for the battle ahead. If it's true that the king did not have a whole bunch of horses and a big army, then they would definitely need to depend on God to be their power, to be their strength, to lead them into victory, or they were not going to succeed. It's interesting that the psalm just before this one, if you look there, it could be seen as that public prayer meeting before the battle that we're talking about now after the battle. In Psalm 20, it has many phrases that begin with, "May the Lord do this for us, may the Lord do that for us." It sounds very much like a prayer more than a song. They're asking God to help them. And in verse 7, we read the familiar line, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." So this king is leading them, and it ends that psalm with, in verse 9, their plea, "O Lord, save the king." And then our psalm begins. In Psalm 21, it shows us that it's a celebration of the strength and deliverance that could have been the battle that happens between these two psalms. And we can read verses 1 and 2 as the results of Psalm 20's war. Now we read it like this: O Lord, in your strength the king rejoices. They looked to God, and God came through. In your salvation, how greatly he exalts, or the whole nation exalts. You have given him his heart's desire and have not withheld the request of his lips. And the writer of this psalm wants us to pause and to contemplate that. That's where this begins. And I think that that's what the word Selah often indicates. There's a pause to reflect on what was just said. And during this mental, musical interlude, we prepare for the rest of this song, which is what the king rejoices in, how this all took place, what God did in his power to lead us to that chorus of "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." Each statement here gives us a reason to sing that chorus over and over again. It is the song of their salvation. Let's look at verse 3. Verse 3 celebrates God's favor toward this king. And remember, it's going to be representative of the king of the whole nation. God's favor on the king. It says, "For you meet him with rich blessings." So the people are rejoicing because they have been blessed. God has abundantly given them what they have needed. And the second line of verse 3 illustrates the blessings with a picture of God setting a crown upon his head of fine gold. That crown is the kingdom. He is a king. And the fine gold expresses the amount of wealth, of prosperity that God has given to that kingdom. And so what this means is that God is the one who establishes the kingdom. He's the one that gave them what they have. And he gives it abundantly because they are filled with fine gold or wealth. And so this is the kind of God that he is. He is so powerful that he would do this. And for those who trust in him, this is what he will do. And if you trust in him today, then you can join in the chorus of verse 13. "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." Verse 4 celebrates God's gift of life for the king. He asked life of you, and you gave it to him. The king had prayed to the Lord that he would survive this battle, that he would lead his people well, that they would win the war, and that they would live, that they would not die. God gave them the victory through his own power. Yet, to his humble servant, here the king, he's given more than just survival. He's given, it says, length of days forever and ever. This means that God is the one who is ultimately the source of their life. He is their hope, the hope of their nation. That when they think about what's coming against them, they don't think about how strong are they, what do they have, what are they going to do? It's, will God be powerful and bring us through? We trust in God, not what we see. We live by faith and not by sight. And so God will eliminate the fear of death because he gives life to his people, for those who trust in him. And if you do, you can join in the chorus of verse 13. "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." Verse 5 celebrates, again, God's sharing of his glory. That it says, the king's glory is great through God's salvation. So the king has glory because of what God has done. And I know you can look elsewhere in the Bible and say that, well, God shares his glory with no one. And yet, in the way that he fights for and provides victory for his own people, what the world sees is that king is victorious. That king has won the war. That nation is becoming great in the eyes of the world. And in that way, God is sharing the glory. The victory is God's, but the glory that God deserves, he shares with his people. It says, you bestow him with splendor and majesty. He makes us look great in this world. He is the one who does it, though, not us. And so what this means is that God is the powerful one who deserves the glory. He's also the one who's willing to share his glory with us, for all who trust in him. And if you do, you can join in that chorus with verse 13. "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." Verse 6 celebrates God's personal presence, that he is with the king. It says, "For you make him most blessed forever. You make him glad with the joy of your presence." And so the king doesn't just trust in God just for the power to win the war, although he does. He also trusts in God because of the joy and the blessing that God himself is to him. That God is a person, and he doesn't just say, "I can do things for you." He says, "I want to be with you." And God himself is the blessing for those who trust in the Lord. And this means that God is the source of all the good in our lives, and he is the joy and the blessing of those who trust in him. And if you do, you can join in the chorus of verse 13, "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." And then verse 7 celebrates God's faithfulness to the king. "For the king trusts in the Lord, and through the steadfast love of the Most High, he shall not be moved." The one who trusts in God's power, if you trust in God to deliver you, what you get is said to be here immovable, unshakable, unbreakable, unstoppable love that will hold you fast, that will never let you go. And that means that God is faithful to use his power to love you, to save you, to bless you, and all those who trust in him. And if you do, you can join in that chorus of verse 13. "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." And that's the end of the first verse or section of this psalm. And these are unbelievable blessings that God has given, specifically, it says, to the king. But what we realize here is every time the king is blessed, the overflow and the abundance of those blessings spills out over into the people. So the people love their king because the king loves their God, and the God serves, blesses, uses his power on their behalf, and everyone is blessed. But it doesn't stop there. God is not just saying, "I will love the king and his people." He's also saying, "I will judge the nations and all of their enemies." And again, this blesses the king, it blesses the people. By acting in divine love toward the king and by acting in divine judgment against his enemies, God's power is just compounded. And there is so much to celebrate. And you realize why this psalm continues to go back to verse 13. In the second verse, you're going to notice how the enemies aren't just battling against the human king. They go out to war. The people do go with their army, whatever it is. The king leads them into war. But what the enemies realize, or maybe they don't, is that they're not just fighting against the human king. They're fighting against a divine king. The king of heaven is on their side. Verse 8, it celebrates God's hand of power against the enemies. It says, "Your hand will find out all your enemies." You can imagine the arm of the Lord. No enemy, no one who opposes him is out of his reach. And then it adds, "Your right hand will find out those who hate you." That is God's dominant hand, or his more powerful hand. That would be this one, not this one. And he reaches and seizes, he finds them all out. He seizes every single enemy of yours. This means that God actively fights for those who trust in him, and no enemy is out of his reach. And if you trust in him, you can join in that chorus of verse 13. "Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength." Verse 9 celebrates God's righteous judgment. So now he's got them in his grip, and he's now judging them. And it says, "You will make them as a blazing oven when you appear. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and fire will consume them." The Old Testament custom, after defeating a nation, was to destroy the nation, to wipe them out as if they had never existed. Everything was set ablaze, and here we read, "like a blazing oven swallowing them and consuming them," so that nothing was left of them. So God will utterly destroy all of the enemies of those who trust in him. And if you trust in him, you can join in that chorus of verse 13. Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength. Verse 10 celebrates God's thorough and total judgment on his enemies. You will destroy their descendants from the earth. God's going to wipe them out. It even says, even their offspring from among the children of man will be destroyed. They will be completely decimated. They will be wiped out. There will be no more evil, no more enemies on the earth at that time. This means that God is entirely just, and he will punish everyone who hates him and those who trust in him. And if you trust in him, you can join in that chorus of verse 13. Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength. And then verses 11 and 12, they celebrate God's guaranteed victory over the enemies. It's guaranteed. It says, though they plan evil against you, though they devise mischief, they will not succeed. It doesn't matter how big their army is. It doesn't matter what kind of artillery they use. It doesn't matter how much destruction they have plotted and how long they've plotted it. It doesn't matter. It says they will not succeed. Why? Because it says, for the Lord will put them to flight. God is going to scare them away. He will aim at their faces with his bows. And they will scatter. And he will grab them. And he will judge them. This means that God's power cannot be defeated. And he will not fail to wipe out all of his enemies once and for all in the end. And if you trust in him, you can join in that chorus of verse 13. Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength. So that's the second verse, and it comes to an end here, and you can't miss the idea that those who are singing this song, who truly, from the bottom of their heart, sing, are doing what the end of verse 13 states. We will sing, and we will praise your power. I mean, there is not one verse that talks about what the people have done. There's not one. Well, actually, they're singing. They're praising God. That's it. Every single verse is about what God has done for them. It's his strength. It's his salvation. It's his blessings. It's his love. It's his hand. It's his bow. It's his power. And when you look at the king, who seems to be a major player in this, we don't see anything much that he has done. That all of this has come through the king, but it's ultimately from God, because all we read that the king does is he rejoices, he exults, he requests, he asks, and he trusts. It wasn't the strength of the king, it was the strength of the Lord that has chosen to give the victory and has acted in power. You see, God, as we see here, we're singing about the strength of the Lord that has been granted to his people through one individual that blesses all of the nation. We are singing about the praiseworthy power of the Lord, not anybody else, but how God has acted for his people. And thanks to that one man whom God anointed and who obediently trusted in the Lord, obeying his commands and his God, through him we are now led into, the people who follow that king are led into his triumphant, eternal, glorious, blessed kingdom forever. And they sing the song. That's all they do. This is the song of salvation. The song of God's people exalts God's power that comes through God's prince. And I wonder, is this your song? See, all of us are in a battle. We all find ourselves in a battle against a formidable foe. That is sin that is seeking to destroy us. There was a ruler whom God first installed on the earth as a human. His name was Adam. He was in the kingdom of paradise. And what we find there is that his rebellion against the Lord, his failure to obey, his sinful heart infiltrated the heart of humanity, of all of us. His misplaced trust, whether it was in himself or in the world or in the devil, his misplaced trust led him to refuse to obey God's commands. and it ended not in eternal life, but eternal death, being outside of the kingdom, in outer darkness, with vain toil and endless torment. And every descendant of Adam, everyone who is in Adam, is guilty and condemned already by nature, because they are counted as in Adam. They were born into that. And this is evidenced in our own lives, because our misplaced trust leads us to refuse to obey our holy Creator and His commands. But graciously, according to the riches of His mercy and the great depth of God's love, the Lord sent a second human ruler. It was His own Son, who would fully trust and sacrificially obey no matter what it cost Him, so that He would receive not eternal death, but eternal life, joy, fulfillment in the presence of God face to face in His kingdom. And His name was Jesus. And He, as the Bible shows us, is the King through whom God brought all the blessings. He brought healing to His people. He's the King through whom He cast out demons from His people. He is the King who raised His people back to life. He's the King who trusted in the Lord's strength all the way to the cross and unto death. He's the King who trusted in the Lord's strength and salvation even while in the tomb. He's the King who was given a crown of fine gold, whose kingdom will never end, was established and given inexplicable wealth. He's the King who was resurrected and given authority to grant eternal life to all of those who trust in Him. He's the King who shares His glory and splendor and majesty with His people. And He's the King whose presence brings joy forevermore. And He's the King who defeated our enemies, not just those who hate God and persecute us, but even sin and death and the flesh and the devil himself. Psalm 21 is a shadow of the real King, Jesus, who is coming, He's coming to rescue His people. And He did it already in the first coming, because He came and obeyed perfectly the way that you and I have failed. And He's come and He's endured the wrath of God fully in the way that you and I have earned it. And therefore, it is through Christ and Christ alone that God has brought victory for His people over death, and He's given eternal life to all who will do what Psalm 21 encourages us to do: to receive God's blessing through one and only one divinely anointed King. And for all who will sing this song, Psalm 21, the song of salvation, those who trust in Him and those who sing this song, we will receive all of this through Jesus Christ.